A homeless man's guitar and his cat silenced the city council. What happened next will move you. The corner of Elm Street and Maple Avenue was, to most, just another intersection in the sprawling tapestry of Oak Haven, a city that prided itself on its historic charm and burgeoning art scene. But to Walter, it was his stage, his sanctuary, his everything. The cracked pavement, the faded brick wall of the old bakery behind him, the wrought iron bench where he sat, these were the constants in a life that had become increasingly defined by its uncertainties. Walter wasn't young, not anymore. The lines etched on his face were a roadmap of a life well lived, or perhaps, more accurately, a life endured. His eyes, a faded blue that hinted at a brighter past, held a perpetual weariness, yet they still sparked with a flicker of something akin to defiance when he picked up his guitar. The instrument, an old Gibson acoustic, was as weathered as he was. It would worn smooth by years of use. Its strings replaced countless times, but its voice still true. He'd arrive at the corner just before noon, every day, rain or shine. The early morning belonged to the commuters, the hurried footsteps and the exhaust fumes. Walter preferred the lull that followed, the time when the city seemed to take a collective breath before the lunch rush. He'd settle onto the bench, carefully placing his worn-out guitar case open on the ground in front of him, a silent invitation for any loose change or, if he was lucky, a crumpled dollar bill. Then he'd begin to play. Not the flashy, showy kind of music that demanded attention, but the quiet, soulful kind that seeped into the cracks of the city's noise. Folk songs, mostly tunes he'd learned decades ago, their melodies carrying the weight of forgotten stories. His voice, though raspy with age and neglect, still held a certain sweetness, a vulnerability that resonated with the passers-by who bothered to stop and listen. He wasn't begging. He never asked for anything. He simply played. The money that accumulated in his case was a byproduct, a necessary means to an end, but it wasn't the reason he was there. He played because it was the only thing he had left that made him feel connected. Connected to his past, to the world around him, to the memories that flickered like dying embers in his mind. And then there was Rusty. The ginger cat appeared one day, seemingly out of nowhere, a flash of orange fur amidst the gray concrete. He was scrawny, his ribs showing through his matted coat, one ear torn at the tip, a testament to a life lived on the streets. Walter had initially shooed him away, fearing the cat would scare off potential contributors. But Rusty had persisted, circling Walter's legs, rubbing against his worn-out boots, his purr a low rumble that somehow harmonized with the guitar's chords. Eventually, Walter had relented. He'd shared a piece of his sandwich with the cat, a meager offering of tuna on stale bread. Rusty had devoured it, then curled up at Walter's feet, as if claiming the spot as his own. And that was that. From that day forward, Rusty was a fixture on Elm Street, the silent, watchful companion to the old musician. He'd lie there, basking in the sun when it shone, huddled under the bench when it rained, his amber eyes half closed, seemingly indifferent to the world around him. But Walter knew better. He'd seen the way Rusty's ears would twitch at the sound of approaching footsteps, the subtle shift in his posture when someone dropped a coin into the case. He was a guardian of sorts, a furry sentinel protecting their little corner of the world. The regulars on Elm Street had come to accept them as a pair. Mrs. Davison, the elderly woman who ran the flower shop across the street, often brought Walter a cup of coffee and a biscuit in the mornings, her wrinkled face creased with a mixture of pity and respect. Mr. Henderson, the retired postman who spent his days reading on a nearby park bench, would occasionally nod his head in time with the music, a silent acknowledgement of their shared solitude. And then there was Sarah. She was younger than the others, perhaps in her late 20s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She worked at the small independent bookstore a few blocks down, and she'd often stop by on her lunch break, lingering for a few minutes to listen to Walter's music. She was the one who had given him the larger bill, a 20 tucked discreetly amongst the smaller coins. "He's a beautiful cat," she'd said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on Rusty. "Does he have a name?" Walter had hesitated, his fingers strumming a melancholic chord. "He doesn't talk, and I don't ask," he'd replied, his voice raspy. "But that's why I'm still sitting here." The words had hung in the air, a cryptic confession that Sarah hadn't pressed him to explain. She'd simply smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and placed another dollar in his case before walking away. The days bled into weeks, the weeks into months. The rhythm of Elm Street was Walter's lifeblood. The rumble of the buses, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant sirens, the occasional laughter of children, it all formed a backdrop to his music, a constant hum that both comforted and isolated him. But one particularly harsh autumn day, the rhythm faltered. A cold wind whipped down Elm Street, scattering leaves and chilling Walter to the bone. His fingers, stiff with arthritis, fumbled on the strings. His voice, weakened by a persistent cough, cracked and faded. Fewer people stopped to listen, their heads down, their bodies hunched against the wind. Rusty, sensing Walter's distress, nudged his hand with his head, his purr louder than usual, a rumbling vibration that seemed to offer a sliver of warmth. Walter managed a weak smile, stroking the cat's fur. "It's all right, old friend," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Just a bit under the weather, that's all." But as the day wore on, Walter's condition worsened. A sharp pain stabbed at his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He felt dizzy, his vision blurring. He tried to keep playing, to hold on to the familiar comfort of the music, but his hands refused to cooperate. The last thing he remembered was the sound of Rusty's frantic meow, a high-pitched wail that pierced through the fog in his mind. Then, everything went dark. The music of Elm Street had fallen silent. This silence caused Sarah, who was used to hearing it from afar, to become worried. The darkness was not unfamiliar to Walter. He'd known its embrace many times before, in different forms, in different places. It was the darkness of a lonely childhood bedroom, the darkness of a hospital waiting room, the darkness of a heart breaking slowly, piece by piece. This time, however, it felt different. Deeper, perhaps, and colder. He wasn't sure how long he was out. Time had lost all meaning. When he finally stirred, it wasn't to the familiar sounds of Elm Street, but to the sterile beeping of machines and the hushed whispers of voices he didn't recognize. He opened his eyes, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room. A nurse, young and efficient, noticed his movement. "Mr. Peterson, you're awake. That's good. You gave us quite a scare." Peterson. It was his name, of course, but it sounded foreign to him now. He'd been Walter the guitar man for so long that he'd almost forgotten the man he used to be. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry and scratchy. The nurse offered him a cup of water with a straw. He sipped it slowly, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. "What happened?" he managed to croak out. "You collapsed," the nurse explained. "A passerby called 911. You were lucky. You had a minor heart attack. We've stabilized you, but you'll need to stay here for a few days for observation." A heart attack. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Walter closed his eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. He was old, he was tired, and he was alone. "Rusty, my cat," he whispered, his voice filled with a sudden urgency. "Where's my cat?" The nurse looked slightly flustered. "I don't know, sir. I'm sorry. I'll see if I can find out." She left the room, leaving Walter alone with his thoughts, his fears, his memories. The beeping of the machines faded into the background as his mind drifted back, pulled by the invisible currents of the past. He saw himself as a young man, full of life and ambition, standing on the porch of a small white house with a neatly trimmed lawn. He was holding a guitar, a brand new Gibson, a gift from his father. He was smiling, his eyes shining with the boundless optimism of youth. This was in Harmony Creek, a small town nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It was a place of simple pleasures, of close-knit communities, of Saturday night dances and Sunday morning church services. Walter had grown up there, surrounded by the love of his parents, the camaraderie of his friends, and the beauty of the surrounding countryside. He'd always loved music. He'd learned to play the guitar from his father, a coal miner with calloused hands and a surprisingly gentle touch. He played in the school band, in church, at local talent shows. He dreamed of making it big, of escaping the confines of Harmony Creek and seeing the world. Then he met Elizabeth. She was the prettiest girl in town, with long auburn hair and eyes the color of the summer sky. He fell in love with her the moment he saw her, standing behind the counter at the local diner, her smile as bright as the neon sign above the door. They were married young, too young perhaps, but they were madly in love. They moved into a small apartment above the hardware store, and Walter got a job at the local factory, making furniture. It wasn't his dream, but it was a steady paycheck, and it allowed him to provide for Elizabeth. They had a daughter, Sarah, a different Sarah from his present-day friend, a beautiful little girl with Elizabeth's eyes and Walter's love of music. They were happy for a while. They were a family. They had picnics in the park, went to church on Sundays, and spent evenings on the porch, Walter playing his guitar while Elizabeth sang along, their voices blending together in perfect harmony. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The factory closed down, throwing hundreds of people out of work. Walter struggled to find another job. The bills piled up. The stress mounted. He started drinking more than he should have. He and Elizabeth fought more often and more fiercely. The music, once a source of joy, became a source of contention. One night, after a particularly bitter argument, Walter packed a bag and left. He told himself he was doing it for Elizabeth and Sarah, that they were better off without him. He told himself he'd go to Nashville, make a name for himself, and then come back for them. He never did. Nashville was a city of broken dreams, a place where countless aspiring musicians came to chase their fantasies, only to find themselves lost in the crowd. Walter was just another face in the sea of anonymity, another guitar player with a story to tell. He played in bars, in honky-tonks, on street corners. He slept in cheap motels, in homeless shelters, on park benches. He wrote songs about his life, about his regrets, about the family he'd left behind. But the songs never reached the right ears. The fame he craved never materialized. Years passed. The letters he wrote to Elizabeth went unanswered. The phone calls he made went straight to voicemail. He lost track of time, of himself. He became a ghost, haunting the streets of Nashville, a shadow of the man he once was. Eventually, he gave up. He drifted from city to city, playing his guitar for spare change, living hand-to-mouth, his dreams reduced to ashes. He ended up in Oak Haven, drawn by its reputation as a haven for artists, a place where he could perhaps find a sliver of solace. And then he found Rusty. The cat was a lifeline, a connection to the world, a reminder that he wasn't completely alone. He gave Walter a reason to keep going, a reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to play his music. The memories faded, leaving Walter back in the sterile hospital room, the beeping of the machines a constant reminder of his mortality. He felt a tear roll down his cheek, a single drop of sorrow for a life lost, for opportunities missed, for a love that had withered and died. The door opened, and the nurse returned. She was accompanied by another woman, older, with a kind face and a gentle demeanor. It was Sarah from Elm Street. "Walter," Sarah said, her voice filled with concern. "I heard what happened. I came as soon as I could. I have Rusty. He's safe." A great relief washed through Walter, a physical relaxation he felt. Rusty, before he was Rusty, was just a nameless ginger kitten, one of a litter born in the dark, damp recesses of a forgotten alleyway behind a row of dilapidated warehouses. His mother, a scrawny, feral tabby, did her best to care for her brood, scavenging for scraps of food and fiercely protecting them from the dangers of the urban jungle. But life on the streets was brutal. Two of Rusty's siblings succumbed to illness, their tiny bodies unable to withstand the harsh conditions. Another was snatched by a hawk, a swift and silent predator that swooped down from the sky, leaving no trace but a lingering scent of fear. Rusty, though small and seemingly fragile, possessed a certain tenacity, a will to survive that belied his tender age. He learned quickly, Mimicking his mother's hunting skills, stalking mice and rats that scurried through the shadows, pouncing on unsuspecting cockroaches, his instincts honed by hunger and necessity. He learned to distinguish between the sounds of the city, the rumble of trucks, the screech of brakes, the shouts of humans, discerning which were threats and which were merely background noise. He learned to read the body language of people, to recognize the difference between a kind hand offering a scrap of food and a cruel foot aiming a kick. He learned, above all, to be wary. Trust was a luxury he could not afford. As he grew older, Rusty ventured further from the alleyway, exploring the wider world beyond. He discovered the hidden gardens behind grand old houses, where he could bask in the sun and chase butterflies. He learned the routes of the garbage trucks, scavenging for discarded treasures amongst the overflowing bins. He encountered other cats, some friendly, some hostile. He learned the intricate social hierarchy of the feline underworld, the unspoken rules of territory and dominance. He fought, he fled, he learned to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that govern the lives of stray cats. He saw kindness, too, in fleeting moments. A little girl who offered him a piece of her sandwich, a shopkeeper who left out a bowl of water on a hot summer day, an old woman who whispered soft words to him as he rubbed against her legs. But these moments were rare, exceptions to the general rule of indifference or outright hostility. Most people ignored him, or worse, chased him away, seeing him as nothing more than a dirty, unwanted creature. He learned to be invisible, to blend into the shadows, to move silently and unnoticed through the urban landscape. He became a master of camouflage, his ginger fur blending seamlessly with the brick walls, the rusty fire escapes, the piles of discarded junk. One day, while scavenging near a busy street corner, he heard a sound that was unlike anything he'd heard before. It was a melody, a series of notes that seemed to vibrate through the air, resonating deep within his chest. He followed the sound, drawn by an invisible force, until he reached the corner of Elm Street and Maple Avenue. There, sitting on a bench, was an old man with a guitar. The man's fingers moved across the strings, producing the music that had captivated Rusty's attention. It was a sad song, full of longing and regret, but there was also a hint of sweetness, a glimmer of hope that shone through the melancholy chords. Rusty watched the man, mesmerized. He'd seen humans with guitars before, street performers who played for money, their music loud and boisterous. But this was different. This music seemed to come from a deeper place, a place of genuine emotion. He crept closer, cautiously, his body low to the ground, his tail twitching nervously. The man didn't seem to notice him, his eyes closed, his head bowed, lost in the music. Rusty sat down a few feet away, listening. The music washed over him, soothing his anxieties, calming his fears. He felt a strange sense of peace, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he'd been a tiny kitten, nestled beside his mother in the warmth of the alleyway. He stayed there for a long time, listening to the man play. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street. People hurried past, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. But Rusty remained, his gaze fixed on the old man, his ears twitching at every note. As the light faded, the man finally stopped playing. He opened his eyes, blinking, as if waking from a dream. He saw Rusty, sitting there, watching him. For a moment, their eyes met. Rusty felt a flicker of fear, expecting the man to shoo him away, to yell at him, to chase him off. But the man did none of those things. He simply stared at Rusty, his expression unreadable. Then, he reached into a bag beside him and pulled out a sandwich. He tore off a piece, a small morsel of tuna, and held it out to Rusty. Rusty hesitated, his instincts warring with his hunger. He took a tentative step forward, then another. He sniffed the offering, his whiskers twitching. It smelled delicious. He took the food from the man's hand, his teeth gently grazing the callous skin. He devoured it quickly, his hunger overcoming his caution. The man smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough. Rusty felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling of connection, of belonging. He purred, a low rumble that vibrated through his body. He rubbed against the man's legs, marking him with his scent, claiming him as his own. The man reached down and stroked Rusty's fur, his touch gentle and reassuring. "You're a stray, aren't you?" he said, his voice raspy but kind. "Just like me." Rusty didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He knew he had found a friend, a companion, someone who understood what it was like to be alone in the world. He curled up at the man's feet, his body pressed against his worn-out boots. He closed his eyes, listening to the man's heartbeat, a steady rhythm that echoed the music he'd played. He was no longer just a nameless stray. He was Rusty, the guitar man's cat, and he had found a home. This feeling brought him peace, even though he could not understand why. The hospital room, though sterile and impersonal, felt almost like a sanctuary after the chaos of Elm Street. Walter, weak but stable, was grateful for the quiet, for the respite from the constant struggle to survive. But his thoughts were consumed by Rusty. Sarah's visit had been a godsend. Knowing that Rusty was safe, that he was being cared for, eased the knot of anxiety in his chest. Sarah had brought Rusty to her apartment, a small, cozy space above the bookstore where she worked. She'd promised to keep him there until Walter was well enough to leave the hospital. "He's a bit skittish," Sarah had said, her eyes filled with compassion. "But he ate a little food, and he's curled up on my bed now. I think he misses you." Walter had managed a weak smile. "He's a good cat," he'd said, his voice raspy. He's my family." Sarah had stayed for a while, talking to him about her life, about the bookstore, about the small joys and challenges of her everyday existence. Her presence was a calming influence, a gentle reminder that there were still kind people in the world. The days that followed were a blur of medical tests, medication, and fitful sleep. Walter's body slowly began to heal, but his spirit remained fragile. He missed Rusty terribly. He missed the familiar rhythm of Elm Street, the feel of his guitar in his hands, the music that had been his solace for so long. He also worried about the future. He had no money, no home, no prospects. He was an old man with a bad heart and a stray cat. What was to become of them? One afternoon, a social worker, Ms. Thompson, came to see him. She was a middle-aged woman with a brisk, no-nonsense manner, but her eyes held a flicker of empathy. "Mr. Peterson," she said, consulting her clipboard, "we need to discuss your discharge plan. You'll be released in a few days, and we need to make sure you have somewhere to go." Walter looked at her, his expression bleak. "I don't have anywhere to go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I live on the street." Ms. Thompson nodded, her face betraying no surprise. "I understand. We have several options available. There's shelters, of course, but they're often overcrowded and, well, they're not ideal. There are also some transitional housing programs, but there's usually a waiting list." She paused, considering. "There's also a possibility of applying for subsidized senior housing, but that can take time. And there's the issue of your cat. Most shelters and housing programs don't allow pets." Walter's heart sank. He couldn't bear the thought of being separated from Rusty. He'd rather sleep on the street than give him up. "I won't leave him," he said, his voice firm despite his weakness. "He's all I have." Ms. Thompson sighed. "I understand, Mr. Peterson, but you need to be realistic. You need a safe place to live, a place where you can receive proper care." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Sarah, holding a carrier. Inside, Rusty peered out, his amber eyes wide and anxious. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Sarah said, her voice hesitant. "But Rusty was so restless, I thought he might want to see Walter." Walter's face lit up. He reached out a trembling hand, and Rusty nudged his head against it, purring loudly. Ms. Thompson watched the interaction, her expression softening. "Well," she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips, "perhaps we can find a way to bend the rules a little." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah, with Ms. Thompson's cautious cooperation, began exploring options that would allow Walter and Rusty to stay together. They contacted local charities, animal rescue organizations, and community outreach programs. It was a long shot, but they found a glimmer of hope. A small, privately funded organization called Second Chance Homes specialized in providing housing and support for elderly individuals with pets. They had a few vacancies in a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The apartments were modest, but they were clean and safe, and they allowed pets. More importantly, they offered a sense of community, a place where Walter could rebuild his life, surrounded by people who understood his situation. Sarah helped Walter fill out the application, providing references and vouching for his character. Ms. Thompson pulled some strings, expediting the process and navigating the bureaucratic hurdles. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, delays, moments of doubt. But finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they received the good news. Walter and Rusty had been accepted. They had a place to live. Moving day was bittersweet. Walter, still weak but steadily recovering, said goodbye to the hospital staff, his heart filled with gratitude. He thanked Ms. Thompson, who had gone above and beyond to help him. Sarah drove him and Rusty to their new apartment. It was small, just a single room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it was clean and bright, with a window overlooking a small courtyard. Rusty, after a brief period of exploration, curled up on the small bed, seemingly content. Walter sat down in a worn armchair, his guitar leaning against the wall beside him. He felt a sense of exhaustion, but also a flicker of hope. The first few weeks were an adjustment. Walter struggled with his health, with the unfamiliar routines of his new life, with the lingering trauma of his past. But he wasn't alone. Sarah visited regularly, bringing groceries, books, and her quiet, reassuring presence. The other residents of the apartment complex, mostly elderly individuals with their own stories of hardship and resilience, welcomed him into their community. He started playing his guitar again, softly at first, then with increasing confidence. His music, once a lament for a lost life, began to take on a new tone, a melody of hope and gratitude. However, not all was smooth. The city council, under pressure from local businesses, had recently passed a new ordinance cracking down on homelessness. Police began aggressively enforcing anti-camping laws, clearing out encampments, and issuing citations to street performers. Word of these actions reached Walter, filling him with anxiety. He knew he was lucky to have a roof over his head, but he worried about his friends, the people he'd left behind on Elm Street. One day, he decided to go back to see how they were doing. He took the bus, Rusty safely tucked away in his carrier. When he arrived at Elm Street, he found the corner deserted. The familiar faces were gone. The flower shop was still there, but Mrs. Davison was nowhere to be seen. Mr. Henderson's bench was empty. He felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss. He had been part of this place, part of this community for so long. Now, it was as if he'd never existed. He was about to leave when he saw a familiar figure walking towards him. It was Sarah. "Walter," she called. Concern showed on her face. "What happened?" Sarah explained. A new law forced them to leave. The tone of the place had changed. Sarah's face was etched with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "They cleared everyone out, Walter," she explained, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "The police came through a few days ago, enforcing the new ordinance. They said it was for the betterment of the community to clean up the streets." The words stung Walter. He knew what cleaning up the streets really meant, making the city more palatable for tourists and wealthy residents, at the expense of the most vulnerable. "Mrs. Davison?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "She's okay," Sarah replied. "She's still running the flower shop, but she's heartbroken. She used to leave out water and scraps for the stray animals. She can't do that anymore. They threatened her with a fine. And Mr. Henderson, he's still around. I see him in the library sometimes. But he's lost. He used to spend all day on that bench, reading and watching the world go by. It was his routine, his connection to the community. Now," she trailed off, shaking her head. Walter felt a surge of guilt. He had escaped, found a safe haven, but he'd left his friends behind to face the consequences. He knew he couldn't single-handedly change the city's policies, but he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. "We have to do something," he he said, his voice firm despite his frail health. "We can't just let them disappear." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "You're right," she said. "We can't." They started small. Sarah used her connections at the bookstore to organize a donation drive, collecting food, clothing, and blankets for the displaced homeless population. Walter, with Sarah's help, contacted Second Chance Homes, the organization that had provided him with his apartment. They agreed to host a meeting, a gathering of residents and community members who wanted to help. The meeting was held in the small community room of Walter's apartment complex. It was a diverse group: elderly residents, young volunteers, social workers, even a few sympathetic city employees who attended off the record. Walter, with Rusty curled up at his feet, shared his story. He spoke of his life on Elm Street, of the friends he'd made, of the music that had sustained him. He spoke of the dignity of every human being, regardless of their circumstances. His words resonated with the audience. Others shared their own stories, their own concerns, their own ideas. A plan began to take shape. They formed a coalition, a grassroots organization dedicated to advocating for the rights of the homeless, to challenging the city's policies, to providing support and resources for those in need. They called themselves the Elm Street Alliance. Their efforts were met with resistance. The city council, backed by powerful business interests, refused to budge. The police continued their crackdown. The media, for the most part, ignored their pleas. But they persisted. They organized protests, marches, letter-writing campaigns. They partnered with other advocacy groups, building a network of support. They held fundraising events, using Walter's music as a centerpiece. Slowly, gradually, they began to make a difference. They secured a temporary reprieve from the enforcement of the anti-camping ordinance. They persuaded the city to allocate more funding for homeless services. They raised awareness, changing the narrative, forcing people to confront the human cost of their policies. Walter, despite his declining health, remained at the heart of the movement. His music, once a personal expression of sorrow and loss, became a rallying cry for justice and compassion. He played at protests, at fundraisers, at community gatherings. His songs, filled with the stories of Elm Street, touched the hearts of those who listened. One evening, they held a benefit concert in a local park. It was a warm summer night, the air filled with the scent of flowers and the sound of music. A large crowd had gathered, a testament to the growing support for their cause. Walter, frail but determined, took the stage, Rusty by his side. He played his old Gibson, his fingers moving across the strings with a newfound strength. He sang his songs, his voice raspy but filled with emotion. He sang of loss, of regret, of the hard realities of life on the streets. But he also sang of hope, of resilience, of the enduring power of human connection. He sang of Rusty, his faithful companion, the ginger cat who had given him a reason to keep going. As he finished his last song, a hush fell over the crowd. Then, a wave of applause erupted, a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very ground. People stood, their faces lit by the glow of the stage lights, their eyes filled with tears. Walter looked out at the crowd, his heart swelling with emotion. He had come a long way from the lonely street corner where he'd once played for spare change. He had found a purpose, a community, a voice. He knew the fight was far from over. There would be more challenges, more setbacks, more battles to be fought. But he was no longer alone. He had Sarah, he had Rusty, he had the Elm Street Alliance. He had a community of people who believed in the power of compassion and the dignity of every human being. The ending, however, was not a triumphant victory, but a quiet, bittersweet acceptance. Walter's health continued to decline. The heart attack had taken its toll, and his body was simply wearing out. One peaceful autumn evening, with Sarah by his side, and with Rusty curled on his chest, with purrs as gentle as the breeze, Walter drew his last breath. His hand, still resting on Rusty's soft fur. His passing was peaceful, a gentle fading away, like the final notes of a beautiful, sad song. Sarah kept her promise. She adopted Rusty, giving him a loving home. The Elm Street Alliance continued its work, inspired by Walter's legacy. They established a small memorial on the corner of Elm Street and Maple Avenue, a plaque with a simple inscription, "Walter Peterson, the music man of Elm Street. He played for us all." The Ballad of Walter and Rusty was not a story of grand victories or miraculous transformations. It was a story of small acts of kindness, of quiet resilience, of the enduring power of companionship in the face of adversity. It was a story of a life lived on the margins, a life that, despite its hardships, touched the hearts of many. It was a story that reminded everyone that even in the darkest of times, there is always music, there is always hope, and there is always love.